Francis Fukuyama is a professor of public policy at George Mason University. His books include The End of History and the Last Man and The Great Disruption, Human Nature and the Reconstitution of Social Order. I interviewed him at the George Mason University School of Public Policy in Fairfax, Virginia. Well, thanks for letting me come here and talk to you today. I was just thinking this morning that I still remember the moment when you became famous. I was at the New Republic magazine here in Washington, and the Cold War was winding down, and everyone was trying to figure out how to make sense of this new era and how to orient themselves. And suddenly, the talk of the town was an essay in the journal The National Interest by someone named Francis Fukuyama called The End of History. You probably remember the essay.
I do remember it,
And
yes.
then it became your best-selling book, The End of History and the Last Man. The end of history, one reason I find the phrase interesting is that the word end has two separate meanings. It can mean just kind of the final stage of a process, but it can also denote purpose. In other words, the idea is that the whole point of the process was to get to this final stage. Maybe the process was in some sense designed to get there. Now, later I'm going to ask you about this kind of cosmic sense of end, which you actually haven't talked much about in your writing. But first, tell me, what did you mean at the time when you said that the end of history may be near?
Well, I believe that the experience of the 20th century, or at least the way the 20th century ended, indicated to me that we really ought to revive a notion of historical progress. Because I think that is one of those ideas that was once believed in the 19th century and then rejected for most of the 20th century, but that the rejection was really due to all of the horrible circumstances that were, I think, in some ways special to the first half of the 20th century. But if you take a longer-term view, there in fact has been a gradual evolution and directionality to human history that points in a certain direction, and it can go backwards. There can be backsliding and all sorts of short-term disasters, but overall there has been an evolution in political institutions, for example, towards modern liberal democracy and a growing universalism about the spread of that institution and legitimacy that encompasses more and more of the world. So that's the sense in which I thought history with a capital H, of the sort that Marx and Hegel wrote about, needed to be resurrected, and an end of history, because where they said it was going to end is just different from where it looks like it really is ending, because they all said it was all heading towards socialism or communism, whereas now it seems pretty clear that we're not going to get to that stage. We're going to end at the stage before that, which is capitalist liberal democracy.
Now, like most people who go out on a limb, you've been subjected to a certain amount of second guessing. Critics say, well, there was, in some of your early writing, you suggested that after the end of history, things almost might become, boring. Life would be so sedate and stable. And people say, tell that to the Bosnians, tell that to the Rwandans. What's your reply?
Well, I think actually the world, if you think about it, has been, despite the Bosnias and Rwandas, has been largely peaceful, because what it takes to produce big instability is for all the large powers in the world to be fighting each other on a planetary scale. That's what happened in the first half of the 20th century, whereas today the most powerful industrialized countries are all liberal democracies. They wouldn't even think of going to war. Japan or Germany or the United States wouldn't even think of competing with each other in a military sense. And so what you have is a world that we haven't seen for a few centuries, where essentially you get a lot of peripheral wars among smaller countries, but really a fairly peaceful situation. And no history in this, history isn't just a matter of war and conflict. It's also you're fighting over something, that there are really big issues that seem to be at stake. And that, I think, in a way has disappeared because everybody agrees on the basic shape of institutions now.
Mm-hmm. So you more or less stand by your thesis.
I do.
History has a direction, and in some ways it is toward the good.
I think that's the other aspect that people really take exception to, that progress should also be progress towards morality. But I think that if you think about this in a much longer term sense, what you've been, this is an idea that you've you've talked about in non-zero, but you think about the scope or what you might call the radius of trust of different societies as you move up from hunter-gatherer through agricultural societies up to, present-day institutions. And what we see is the fighting at the periphery of that radius, but in fact the radius has constantly been growing larger and larger, and the principle that liberal democracy embodies is that the radius ought to encompass all of humanity. There's a moral universalism to it, which means that it can't get any larger, and that's the sense in which I think we've reached an end. Mm-hmm. Maybe, we may have aliens to deal with at some point, but for the time being at least.
Okay, well, that'll give you something to write another book about. So, have you, in any fundamental respects, revised your thinking?
Well, I have in the following sense that if you ask the question, why is there history, my basic answer to that was that you have history because you have modern science. That science unfolds in one direction. You don't uninvent, the Newtonian laws of physics or relativity or anything of that sort. The science gives you technology. The technology gives you an economic horizon of production possibilities. It gives you military technology and the various things that define the level and the political institutions and economic institutions ultimately of a society. Now, in my view, you can have an end of history in a sense only if you have, well, there's two things that you'd have a true end of history. One, I think we do have, which is human nature. And the kind of argument I was trying to put forward was that you have this evolution where you try different institutions, and some of them work and some of them don't, and you only learn that over time. But ultimately, the ones that are permanent and that will work are ones that are the most compatible with human beings as they actually are. This is why utopian regimes like, the various socialist ones we've seen failed, because they had the wrong, view of what human being or what human nature was. So that's one thing that can produce an end of history. But the other thing is, in a sense, you have to have an end of science, because science is, and the technology it produces is constantly changing the environment that people have to adapt to. And I think that it's fairly clear, particularly with biotechnology, that we're not really anywhere near the end of science, as we enter the 21st century.
Huh. And you're working on that question now, right?
That's right. I'm trying to do a book on the political implications of essentially the ability to abolish human nature, because, as I said, that's directly, one of the consequences of human nature as it is, I think, is liberal democracy and market-based economics. Mm-hmm. And if you take away the premise that human beings are, the way we've understood them for the last, few tens of thousands of years, then other political forms might become possible.
Okay. Now, on this, on the question of the second meaning of the word "end," do you think that to say that history has a direction, especially to say that it heads toward the good in some sense, is to suggest that there is some kind of overarching purpose at work?
Well, of course, teleology has been out of favor for at least the last 2,500 years. Well, maybe not that long, but a good long while. And I think that that it is something that we at least ought to be open to the possibility of, because I believe that in a certain sense modern natural science is much more confident that it has closed all of the doors and avenues, to teleology than is actually the case. That's not to say that you can prove that there is an end, or that that you want to make an easy resort to that kind of an explanation. But I do think that we have to at least be open to that possibility. And I think certainly the directionality of this evolutionary process suggests that there might be some purpose. Mm-hmm. Tocqueville, for example, he said that the march of democracy has been going on for at least 800 years prior to when he wrote, and it seemed to show the hand of some higher being at work, and it is a remarkable thing if you think about why it's going on at the end.
You said that you think science is in some ways a little too cocksure, at least on this teleology issue, on the question of whether history has some kind of higher purpose.
I think that what science has shown is that if there is an intervention from something outside of the laws of physics. It's not something that comes about in the year 4005 BC or whenever in the sense of creationism. That the laws of physics are fairly fairly regular, and we don't see any reason to doubt them. I think there are two real aspects where not all the doors have been closed. The first has to do with cosmology, modern cosmology, because in a sense, this idea that creation began with the Big Bang immediately raises the question, well, what existed prior to the Big Bang? In a sense, all teleological theories, argue that there was a beginning of history and therefore an end. And what modern physics has shown is that, in fact, we can point to a beginning. The universe, in that sense, was not eternal; it was created. And in fact, a lot of modern cosmological theories, show that it was a event of such unbelievably low probability that it makes you wonder, why did it lead to the universe that we see? I think at the other end, you have a further question about human uniqueness and human dignity, because I think that the product at the other end of this evolutionary chain is something that I think is quite hard to understand in terms of all of the parts that came before it, things like human consciousness, human emotions, all of the things that actually make us, believe that we are something special in creation, I think have not been, fully demystified by Darwinism or by modern neuroscience or by all of the other, scientific disciplines that have been chipping away at that, but I think have not really gotten there yet.
Do you think some modern scientific interpreters have been a little facile in their handling of consciousness, for example, in that way, in dismissing the difficulty of the problem?
Well, I think not some. I think most of the field has been, much too facile. I mean, in the question of consciousness, a large number of the writers on consciousness basically define the problem away either by overtly saying that it doesn't exist or somehow that what we think of as consciousness is just somehow an illusion, or defining it in terms that are then explainable, by the material causality that they, understand to be the only form of causality that exists. And I think that, in fact, no one has even come close to asking, or to answering the basic Cartesian question, that consciousness and thought and emotion, all of those subjective states are just a different order of being, seem to be a different order of being, so it's even hard to understand what a scientific explanation of its emergence would even look like. And that's not to say that it has a divine source. I mean, but it just means that I think modern natural science is not as certain as it thinks it is that it can answer these questions.
And it's certainly true, or at least arguably, that consciousness, in the broad sense of subjective experience, is what gives life meaning. I mean, if it weren't anything, right. if we were just robots, if we looked just like we look and behave just like we behave, but it was not like something to be us, then it seems to me moral questions would really lose their significance. I mean,
no, that's absolutely true. I mean, there's a silly line that comes out of strong artificial intelligence that holds that the mind is just this big computer, and that if you have a computer that gets up to the same level of complexity as a human brain, that it's going to start acting, like a conscious human mind. And I think what that abstracts from is that, the human mind is really much more than that. It's the seat of all of the emotions and the desires. And ultimately, these are the source of moral feelings and of human morality itself. Human morality really has to do with human purposes that are defined by wants and desires and indignation and all of those internal states. And if you don't have that, you don't have 99% of what it means to be a human being.
Yeah, and further, if you ask me why do I think it's wrong to walk up to someone, and whack them in the head, it has to do with the fact that it hurts when you do it. I mean, if subjective experience is, for me at least, what gives meaning to the concepts of right and wrong when you're dealing with human beings.
No, that's absolutely right, and you can certainly, I mean, if you just take a functionalist interpretation of, why you say that, well, you have this subjective sense of pain because you want to avoid, damage if you put your hand in the flame. But, you can do that without the subjective sensation. I mean, you can design a robot that will sense flame and pull itself away. But why we have to feel the things that we feel, I think, are much less clear.
Yeah, and it seems to me that ironically that view emerges actually from a quite scientific view of the world. It's if you are a true scientific materialist, then you believe exactly that in principle you can build a robot just as complex as us, and in your whole causal flow chart showing how it works, and consciousness doesn't have to enter in anywhere. You can do it all mechanistically in principle, and yet consciousness is here. It seems to me for reasons more mysterious than anybody but you or me seems to understand.
That's right.
No, there are others.
And also, it's the tail end of a process of such unbelievable complexity that, I mean, I think that just in itself is a matter worth pondering. I mean, I suppose people will say, well, given 4 or 5 billion years, you can do anything, but it is, it is really astonishing that it leads to such an organized result.
Lately, I've kind of been thinking about the evolution of religion, and one thing religions have done is help kind of give coherence to social organization at various levels. If you go way, way back and start, with kind of hunter-gatherer societies, agrarian chiefdoms, and so on, very often you find religions playing a fundamental role in holding societies together. One of your books was called Trust. It was about the importance of trust within societies in just conducting day-to-day economic activities,
right,
solving various kinds of problems. And religions, of course, have played a role in
a critical role, sure.
Yeah. Do you have you seen any kind of directionality in the evolution of religions?
Well, first of all, I think that there is a functional purpose to religion, as you've indicated, that a lot of natural scientists don't take it all seriously, which I think is a big mistake. And there is a kind of modernist worldview that says that religion belonged to an age of pre-scientific rationalism, and that all religions are just these silly myths that people make up, but that you can somehow stand disabused of them. I think that if you look at the actual sociological function of religion, they're extremely important and continue to be important today. And I think that we're never going to ever have a workable, disenchanted, totally religiously disenchanted society, because in fact religion is the source of common cultural and moral rules by which social cooperation happens. You can have social cooperation like the economists try to argue on the basis of rational individuals interacting in a game theoretic manner, but I think realistically that's not the way that real world societies ever arrive at cooperative rules. In fact, they're handed down from people's culture and their toilet training, and they're based on unquestioned assumptions and authority, but that you can't get away from that.
So religion is more functionally important than maybe some people realize. But you are still, even if having said that, you're still left with the problem, the oft commented on problem of kind of religion in an age of science, in an age when science has stripped away at least some of the beliefs on which traditional religions have rested. What are the prospects for keeping alive a belief system that you're saying is essential, even as it seems to be threatened in some ways?
Well, I think that religions evolve to meet new circumstances, and so in some sense the development of monotheistic religion was critical in getting people away from the simple kind of animism. It allowed people to abstract from the concrete reality that was around them, and it also laid the basis for what we understand to be modern moral universalism, this idea that there's an essence to all human beings regardless of their outward appearances. I mean, this is a religion. This is an idea that doesn't come out of philosophy or out of science. It really comes directly, I think, out of, in a way, the whole Judeo-Christian, tradition that then spreads, to other parts of the world. And I think that, in a sense, the possibility of having cooperation at larger levels way beyond the level of the nation state really depends in part on people having shared cultural outlooks. Samuel Huntington has talked about the clash of civilizations in a very pessimistic sense. He says there are 7 or 8 major cultural systems, and the fault lines between them are going to be the sources of global conflict. But you can look at that as being either half empty or half full. You can also say, well, look, we're down to 7 or 8. I mean, if you looked at what the world was like 10,000 years ago, there would have been, as many different religious systems as you had little tribes running around the world, each one of which would bump up against another little tribe and club each other to death because of sectarian differences in the particular gods that they worshipped. And now you're down to a world system in which all 5 billion people in the world can be grouped into 7 or 8 major cultural groups where you have hundreds of millions of people that basically share common assumptions. And I think that the prospect is that in a sense there's that's not going to be the end story in that evolution, that there will be a movement towards greater shared assumptions about what constitutes the basis for morality that arise out of this.
And have you seen signs of either in what popes do or what anyone else does these days of more and more of an attempt to at least tolerate other religions?
Well, there's certainly a lot of toleration. The question is, the usual sociological problem is that if you tolerate too much, you actually don't end up believing in anything. It's sort of like mainline Protestantism. They became so ecumenical that everyone stopped going to their churches
right.
because there wasn't really anything, any core to the belief. What I perceive is that, you had 50 years ago, you had a broad belief among sociologists that modernization meant secularization, that there was no question that the more modern, technologically a society became, the more disabused of religion it would be. As an empirical fact, that just seems not to be true. The only part of the world where it is true is Europe, is Western Europe. And other modern societies, the United States in particular, but Japan and other places, don't seem to necessarily be following that pattern. And so the European experience, in a way, may be simply related to things having to do with European culture at this particular juncture, and not a universal fact of history. And in fact, if you look around the United States, there's a lot of longing and actually a kind of return to religious belief among well-educated people that accept modern science in large measure, but who feel that it simply is not enough to make their lives satisfying.
And does that figure into what you wrote about in the book The Great Disruption, about a kind of restoration of moral values that may be going on now?
No, I think that's absolutely true. That I believe that morality actually has a very natural basis because, in a way, we're programmed by evolution to cooperate socially, and so we have emotions that promote that kind of cooperation, among which are this very strong desire for bonding in various sorts that is traditionally satisfied by things like shared religion. And so in a sense, the Woody Allen movie where Woody Allen gets cancer and then decides that he has to have some religion, any religion, so he goes on this shopping spree in the supermarket of, the world's religions. And, in a way, that's a lot of people think of religion in America like that everyone makes up their own religion and just picks the one that they like the best. But I think, in fact, that's not what drives most people to religion. People want shared values that create community and common bonds with other people. They don't want infinite moral autonomy. And I think that that's part of what's going on in the U.S. right now. People want to bond with their communities. They want to, know their neighbors. They want to be able to, communicate in a shared language with other people. And I think that's what drives a lot of the return to religion.
Mm-hmm. You said that the basis for your everyday life and your everyday moral conduct is not fundamentally a religious one. You said it's Aristotelian. What does that mean in a kind of concrete everyday sense? I mean, when you are trying to decide whether to do something that's right or wrong, and you don't do the wrong thing, it's not just for fear of being caught, right?
Right. Well, that's a little complicated because your everyday behavior is shaped really by your culture, and I would not argue that all of the cultural rules by which you live are, the direct products of what you are naturally or your, instincts or so forth. I mean, there really is an interplay between environment and nature that produces the actual moral decisions, so whether you you inform on a relative that's cheating on their, broken the law or something is something that I think is answered differently in one culture and, and in another. And so that kind of decision is really, Aristotle has nothing to do with that kind of a decision. I think what that means, though, is that in terms of how you think about moral choices is very much influenced by the degree to which you think that moral rules are universal or are simply culturally determined. I believe that there is much less flexibility in moral rules than a lot of people believe. I'm not a relativist, so I think that in fact, certain kinds of choices that are made in societies today, are ones that people will live to regret because in fact they kind of violate norms that would be established by this, this more universal kind of human nature. It also has an effect. I mean, I'm getting, you wanted to talk about me, and I'm getting away. I'm abstracting, but it affects, issues like human rights and your view of whether human rights are enforceable in a country like China. If you believe that there's a moral universalism that transcends, cultural distinctions, then I think you will believe that there is a duty, that foreigners or outsiders or people outside the culture have to try to, have those certain kinds of rights respected.
So you have a sense of absolute right and absolute wrong without appealing to religion.
Well, it becomes, it's hard when you pose it in those terms. You say, well, you believe in absolute right, so give me an example of an absolute right. And in fact, nothing ends up being that neatly categorical. But I do think that there are universal rights, yes, and that you can make the argument for them without having to appeal to religion. Religion is very helpful in getting people to agree with you, but I think that it's possible to make the case without religion.
And this is kind of what you referred to as the Aristotelian project.
That's right. Aristotle really doesn't talk about religion anywhere in his philosophy. He was adopted by Thomas Aquinas in medieval Catholicism and put, into a Catholic framework. But in fact, Aristotle stands on his own in terms of beliefs about nature that don't require religion.
But you're not yet convinced that the Aristotelian project can work? I mean, it's a kind of a work in progress in the modern world?
Well, I guess I have a very strong intuition that it has to be right on some level. And whether you can, make the philosophical argument for why everything that we know about modern natural science will support an Aristotelian argument is a very, tough one to make. Among other things, Aristotle believed in teleology. He believed in the eternity of the species. He believed in formal causality. A lot of things that modern natural science has either debunked completely or, threatens in a very strong way. And so the question is, how much of that framework can you keep, accepting something like Darwinism? I believe that you can still keep an important, part of it. For example, belief in a certain universalism about morality. But it's a hard argument, and I have to admit, I'm not absolutely sure that you can you certainly can't make it in a way that will convince everybody. Whether you can make it in a respectable philosophical way is still a challenge.
And does that matter, whether you can make it in a philosophical way? In other words, in terms of everyday life, are there many people whose moral conduct depends on whether you can come up with this philosophical underpinning?
Probably not, but I think that it's important in the following sense, that if you believe that, a certain kind of moral outlook is important, and if the only basis that you can convince people that it's true is on the basis of a religious prior, then I think that you're in a certain amount of trouble because, in a country like the United States, it's very diverse religiously, and also I think people tend to dismiss your argument if you say that it has to stand on a, on a religious principle. It's certainly a nice shortcut if in fact people share your religious assumptions, then you don't have to explain to them why why it's true. But there's an important audience out there who can be convinced of an important moral argument, but not if it requires a religious starting point. And that's that's the group I think that might be susceptible to a more Aristotelian argument that is based on, empirical, natural science that doesn't require a big leap of faith to explain why it's the case.
Although you still think that the smooth functioning of the world may always depend on a certain number of people actually having taken the leap of faith.
That's right. That's right. I think that's right. And I think in the United States, if you're going to make a case for anything, you've got to rely on both, people that have those prior, that have made that prior leap of faith, and people that will never make it but can still be convinced in a more, empirical, rational way.
Okay. And finally, your everyday kind of orientation to the world is not fundamentally a religious one. Is there any connection between it and the work that you're probably best known for, the idea of a direction in history? Does the idea that history is heading somewhere help orient you on an everyday basis?
Well, sure. I mean, I think if you believe that your institutions or the institutions that we see or the struggles, the political struggles we see around us are not just the, accidental byproduct of today's politics, but actually represent a much larger evolution in human affairs, then I think it puts things in a different, in a different perspective. And I think it forces you to see, kind of abstract to the basic principles and ask, where did they come from and why have they survived? So I think it does have a very direct impact.
So in your mind, it imbues them with a kind of significance, even if you don't make the inference that they are the end in some purposive sense, that they represent a kind of divine design.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. Well, as I said earlier, I believe that you can make a strong case for the end of history based on human nature, that there is a certain set of institutions that are much more appropriate than all of the competitors, given the way human beings actually are, which I believe are liberal democracy and market-based economics. And that doesn't give them the sanctity as if, this were an eternal principle laid down by a divine creator, but it gives them much greater solidity than, a lot of other interpretations, which will simply say, well, this is just the cultural creation of a certain segment of Northern Europe, at a particular point in the 20th century that just happened to spin out these crazy ideas and impose them on the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's a pretty good time to be alive then, in your judgment.
Well, I think so.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for letting me come here.